Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last conference day of the year, the last senior lecture day of the year, and the last senior lecture. I'll get some thank yous out of the way ahead of time. Thanks, Dr. Kim. You were very helpful bouncing ideas off of for this lecture. Thank you to my parents who were also very helpful bouncing ideas off this lecture. I think they're somewhere in the Zoom cloud. And thank you to all of my co-residents and the rest of the faculty for dealing with me over the last 4 years. I'm really glad to be able to finish out the year with this lecture. So we'll get started. So I started thinking about this topic over 10 years ago when I was transitioning out of my career in finance and considering going into medicine. At that time, I felt kind of lost. I felt unhappy with the trajectory that I was headed in. Wasn't sure how I got there, and I wasn't really sure how to get out of it and what I should do with my life. And in the process of figuring out what to do, I was referred to a TED Talk by this woman, Susan Cain, who also wrote a book called Quiet: The Power of Introversion in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And I found it very powerful. At face value, this book is obviously about introversion and extroversion, but it's also about a larger concept of self-awareness and the importance of recognizing your true self and being comfortable with your true self. And reading her and listening to her talk really helped me think about the kind of person I am, the environments that I thrive in, and things that are difficult for me, and really helped me to end up where I am today. My goal is to introduce you to some of these topics and some of these concepts that you might learn more about yourself and some of your colleagues. Oops. There we go. With that said, some disclaimers. Hold on one second, I'm sorry. There we go. Perfectionist here. First, some disclaimers. So as I said, this is in large part based on Susan Cain's book and her TED Talk. I use that as a jumping off point to go into some of the literature and theories and the research that she discusses, and then was able to bring in my own concepts and try to sort of make it my own. But if I highly encourage anyone who finds this stuff interesting to go read the book, watch the lecture. It's a quick 20-minute TED Talk, and maybe you can use it as a jumping off point for yourself as well. Another word on quality of evidence. Glad that Dr. Sinner is here. The quality of evidence for these types of psychological research is not what we're used to with respect to evidence-based medicine. It's a lot of observational data, a lot of self-reported data, and there's very few randomized controlled trials. So it's obviously a different quality of evidence than what we're used to. But with that said, I hope that everyone, I do think that as you see some of these theories, they do make sense, and I find them powerful, and I hope you'll just keep an open mind. And lastly, I just want to touch on the fact that we're going to be talking about one aspect of personality. Anyone who's done any research or reading about personality and behavior will have come across the idea of the big 5 personality traits. This is the idea that you can encompass all of human interaction and behavior across 5 different spectrums of interaction. One of the spectrums is introversion and extroversion, but you also have other things like agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. And so today we're obviously going to talk about one, and I don't think that you can define a person based on one aspect of personality. My intention today is not to label anyone. And if I say something about an introverted personality or an extroverted personality, and you associate with that, but you don't agree with what I said, I hope that I don't alienate or offend you. And I would just hope that you keep an open mind. So with that said, dive right in. So prior to this introduction, I had a pretty colloquial understanding of introversion and extroversion. This is the picture that I associate extroversion with. partying, being loud, being social, being outgoing. And this is what I associate with introversion. More isolated, relying on yourself, sort of inward thinking. But I always was conflicted by these two very specific pictures, because while I associated more with this picture, I definitely considered myself social. I didn't consider myself shy or quiet. And so it never really sat quite well with me. And I always felt sort of guilty about my own introverted tendencies, as if that was something that I should change about myself, or something that I should be better at, so I could be more extroverted. And I was never really sure where that guilt came from. And so there's that. So I based this lecture on my experience, but I also want to draw you in. And I wanted to draw the faculty and the residents in. And so I sent out a survey, and thank you everyone for responding. I got an overwhelming number of responses. I think we had over 60 people between residents and faculty. I think that I was first very relieved to see that many of you are introverts, which means this talk will probably go well. Surprisingly so, depending on which literature or what study you look at, they estimate that anywhere between a third to 1/2 of the population, in the US at least, associates with introversion. And so we're a little bit beyond that. You had about 60% of us associate with introversion, about 30% with extroversion, and then 10% or so, we're not sure. The next question that I asked was for you to describe to me what you thought introversion meant. Because I wanted to get an understanding of what your baseline is. And based on the responses, I was pleasantly surprised to see that many of you have had some exposure to this before, some exposure to the idea of introversion and extroversion. In the middle, this is a word cloud, and so it aggregates like the most common responses. I took a little bit of liberties to try to coordinate everyone's responses, but you can see the biggest central things are things like quiet and reserved, which is consistent with that common colloquial understanding that I had. But then you see a lot of people talking about energy. The idea that you have energized by alone time, exhausted by socializing, recharges alone. So many of you have been exposed to energy as at least some component of introversion and extroversion. And similarly with the extroverted cloud. At the center, you have things like social, loud, outgoing, but then you have this concept of energy, energized by others, recharged by others, energized by socializing. And energy is really what Carl Jung meant. And there's no one definition of introversion and extroversion, but if you had to put a finger on it, it is about energy. He said, each person seems to be energized by either the external world, extroversion, or the internal world, introversion. So at its core, it's about energy. Introverts tend to be exhausted by external stimulation, and they recover their energy by being alone. Whereas extroverts rely on external stimulation in order to restore their energy when they're wiped out. And this idea definitely resonated with me. I always enjoyed socializing. I think about going to breakfast in the morning after a busy shift though, and it just is so it was exhausting for me, even though I desperately wanted to do that. Because I knew that it would make me more tired to socialize further after an end of a busy, frenetic shift. And so I appreciated that. But if you go into further into Carl Jung's book called Psychological Types, he really drills down and tries to describe these two types. He says, with regards to introverts, in a large gathering, the introvert feels lonely and lost. He has no love for enthusiastic get-togethers. His own world is a safe harbor, a carefully tended and walled-in garden, closed to the public and hidden from prying eyes. His own company is the best. Does anybody have any like guttural reactions to this? Anybody think it's like positive or negative? A little extreme. Yeah. I think that it's pretty extreme as well. I don't think it's a flattering way to describe introverts. I consider myself introverted, but I wouldn't want to be described this closed off. Yet this is how he says introverts. Similarly, for extroverts, he says, the extrovert has a desire to influence and be influenced by events, a need to join in and get with it. The cultivation of friends and acquaintances, none too carefully selected. Should something unmentionable nevertheless befall him, he prefers to forget it. Anything that might tarnish the parade of optimism and positivism is avoided. Any reactions I can hear from the audience? Yeah, a little extreme, right? But that's exactly what he is describing. He's describing extremes. He does not believe that you can be one or the other. You exist somewhere on the spectrum, and he even says there is no such thing as pure introvert or pure extrovert. Such a man would be in a lunatic asylum. However, the concept that this guilt that I felt about introversion and my tendencies is definitely a real thing. And I believe that other people feel this as well. So where does this come from? He's talking about two extremes, and he's trying to describe these extremes as a spectrum, but he doesn't put weight on one side or the other. He describes them both, in the extremes at least, as equally negative, and therefore sort of neutral. But we have this bias, and in trying to understand the bias, I think that you all agree that the bias exists. These are the words, they're some of the smaller words that people use to describe introverts and extroverts, your words in the word cloud. You see words on the introverted side like homebody, antisocial, shy. Someone even said, please leave me alone. You also see on the extroverted side, words like friendly, confident, people person, social butterfly. There is this clear positive connotation with extroversion and a negative connotation with introversion, which is something that I have always felt and never quite understood. You can see this further in one of the other questions that I asked you about what do you wish, if you wished you were something that you were not. There's a whole bunch of people that were very happy where they are, which is great. But then you have almost 30% of the responses that said they wish they were more extroverted, whereas you only have one person that said, I wish that I was more introverted. So where does this come from? Why are we biased in one direction or the other? Now, so Susan Cain in the book suggests that it's part of a cultural ideal that's created in the United States over the last 100 years, based on our history and based on various things that have happened. She makes the argument that as a culture, we've grown up to idealize extroversion. And we have associated, even subconsciously, extroversion with success. And so we're going to go through some of these examples. If you look in the history of urbanization in the US, in 1790, basically there were no cities, right? 3% of people lived in urban areas. Fast forward to 1920, you have a 30-fold increase in, sorry, a 10-fold increase in the population of city dwellers. And by 2018, you have 84% of people living in cities. And if you think about it, this causes a shift in the way that people interact with other people. Previously, before the, at the turn of the century, you may interact with your family, maybe a close neighbor, but that's pretty much it. And so your focus is mostly internal and not external. Whereas as people start to migrate to the cities, all of a sudden you interact more and more with complete strangers on a daily basis. And so there is this shift in your perception. There's a shift in how you are perceived and how you perceive others. All of a sudden this becomes very important. The external becomes much more important because you're now able to judge someone just by looking at them. And with this, there's a rise in the importance of extroverted tendencies. Robert Sussman is a historical researcher who basically categorized the most common self-help terms in books pre-1900 and post-1900. And pre-1900, you see a lot of these terms like citizenship, honor, reputation, integrity, very strong internal feelings. Whereas post-1900, you have all this external, almost superficial type of characteristics, magnetic, fascinating, attractive. These are things that you either are or you're not, and it's difficult to try to be glowing or try to be, attractive. Whereas the other side is terms that you can work on and try to make it more personal to you. If you look at the idea of the movie star, sort of didn't exist prior to 1910. If you look at the number of movie theaters that existed between 1907 and just 7 years later, you increase from around 5,000 to 180,000 theaters. It's like a 35-fold increase in the number of theaters, which goes to show how obsessed we become with celebrity and status. If you look at the advertising during the time in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, you see this focus on personality-driven advertising. You know, people that are selling shaving cream by saying critical eyes are sizing you up right now, or a soap ad that says all around you people are judging. My favorite is an ad for medication that says for anxiety that comes with not fitting in. And in case you guys are wondering, Serental is an antipsychotic, which is ultimately taken off the market due to prolonged QT. I just wanted to put a little medicine in there for you guys. So these are all very personality driven, and it's all about external. If you look at education in the 40s and the 50s, and like our hierarchy, the Harvards and the Yales, these institutions all wanted to accept extroverts, and they wanted to promote that. Paul Buck was the Harvard provost, which is basically the president of the university between 45 and 53. And he said Harvard should reject the sensitive neurotic type and the intellectually overstimulated in favor of boys of the healthy extroverted kind. Yale, similarly, Alfred Griswold, president of Yale in 1951 to 63, said the ideal Yalie is not a beetle-browed, highly specialized intellectual, but a well-rounded man. We see little use for the brilliant introvert. If you fast forward to Wall Street in the 80s, if anybody's ever read Tom Wolfe or Michael Lewis, they both worked in that field and present this idea of the CEO as this mythical, magical creature, master of the universe, whose pure job is to be confident and strong. The idea that the CEOs should be charismatic and have the ability to rally their troops and make decisions on limited information, but with confidence and resolve. Business schools today still push forward the idea of collaboration, networking skills, and communication over individual skills, and they focus on these as the key to success. If you look at office space and structure between 1970 and 2010, you see a dramatic change in how offices are actually organized. Not only does the office size per square foot drop by half, you also have a much more focus on open plans, whereas you used to have individuals in closed offices around the outside, and then if you wanted to collaborate, you could come in the middle. Now you don't have individual offices anymore. And a lot of the 70% of office plans have become open. Even though there's a lot of research that says that this actually makes employees more anxious and underperform. And lastly, you can look at social media, right? Over the last 20 years, the idea of Facebook friends, amassing followers on Instagram and Twitter, they have all become measures of success. Who here hasn't posted something on Instagram only to check a couple minutes later how many likes you got? It all furthers, and then you can look at the idea of the social influencer, which is a very new concept. These are regular folks who have become major players in various industries like clothing and food, simply because they're being loud and they're promoting themselves and they're amassing followers, but they don't necessarily have an authority on this subject. It all furthers a cultural bias that promotes extroversion as a measure of success. And over the last 100 years, I think this has definitely influenced us. But if you look outside the United States, this is not always the case. Robert McCrae is a personality psychologist who studied personalities as it affects and tried to make associations with geography and culture. He sent out, he was able to amass 28,000 self-identified survey results across 36 cultures, and then tried to map these and try to associate different characteristics with different geographic locations. Interestingly, what he found, and I recreated a map for introversion and extroversion, is that there is a clear association and a correlation between geography and the majority of what people identify with. The pink is the extroverts, and the yellow are the introverts. Countries like the United States, like Canada, like Western Europe, a lot of the European cities, all identify with extroversion. Whereas if you look at cultures in the East, China, Russia, Malaysia, Japan, all of these cultures idealize introversion, or they recognize that introversion is a majority, and I can only assume that they idealize the introversion as opposed to us who idealize the extroversion. Culture definitely plays a large part into what we consider desirable. But I don't think that it offers an explanation as to what actually causes introversion and extroversion. Are there physiologic, inborn, or biologic things that make us act a certain way, and are those things heritable? And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we're going to talk about a couple different theories of the physiology of introversion and extroversion. And this is going to head towards nature versus nurture, but I don't want to give away too much. The first theory is, and this is going to try to be in progression with time. So Hans Eysenck is a German-born British psychologist. He was born in 1916. This is around the time, he grew up around the time of Carl Jung. Given that he had limited access to the kind of technology that we have today, he was very limited in the kinds of studies and the things that he could do. But one thing he did have and was exposed to was neuroanatomy, which was blowing up at this time. His book, so he made a book, he wrote a book called Biological Basis of Personality. And in it, he talks about the ascending reticular activating system as the key to introversion and extroversion. You guys will remember maybe from med school that the ascending reticular activating system connects the midbrain structures to the cortex by the thalamus and is responsible for cortical arousal and consciousness. This is true, and we know this now, but what he presumed was that the arousal is different in different individuals. And he said that this is what causes introversion and extroversion. He said that the arousal is like a stimulation gateway. And in some people, it acts very tight, and in other people, it lets all the stimulus through. He proposed that introverts are the type that have a wide open gateway. And introverts let all of the stimulus through, and they're constantly flooded with stimulation. So they exist at this place of hyper arousal and hyper stimulation. And so it makes sense that they would then seek quiet reprieves to bring their level of stimulation down so they could function. Extroverts, on the other hand, are the opposite. Their arousal is tightly controlled. They don't let enough stimulus through, and so they're constantly under-aroused. I just want some water. Never mind. So they're constantly under-aroused. And he proposed that basically your stimulation or your level of arousal had an optimum. And in order to find that optimum, and the optimum level was different. So this is his graph that I recreated. Again, pink is extrovert, yellow is introvert. And this is the idea that your performance becomes optimal at a certain spot on your stimulation. And if you're acting outside of that, you fall off your curve. And between extroverts and introverts, extroverts have a higher level of optimal stimulation, and introverts have a lower level of optimal stimulation. What was his evidence for this? The evidence wasn't great. He has these two, his most famous experiment is something called the lemon juice experiment. I couldn't actually find the paper, but it's the idea that he says that introverts are so hyperstimulated that they actually respond to stimulation more than extroverts. And so he put introverts and extroverts in a room and gave them drops of lemon juice and somehow measured their salivation and said that introverts salivated more with lemon juice than the extroverts.
Especially when you drink it.
Right, we're getting there. And so take it with what you will. There's been multiple references to this study, but I obviously couldn't find anything specific. One of the more convincing arguments was done after he retired in an experiment we'll call the noise decibel experiment, done by a Russell Green. He took 70 introverts and 70 extroverts and exposed them to ambient noise, and then split them into two groups. One group was able to control the level of ambient noise, and the other group was forced to listen to a level of ambient noise that was fixed, and then had them play a challenging word game or a word puzzle. He found that the introverts categorically picked a lower decibel level that was optimal for them to complete the game, and the extroverts picked a higher level. But when he forced them to listen to the wrong decibel, both groups underperformed, which seems pretty consistent with this graph. What was his evidence for heritability? Again, it was not great. He used monozygotic and dizygotic twin studies. Some of you may know that I'm a twin. I'm an identical twin. That's me on the right, I think. And that's my mom. And so the idea here is that monozygotic or identical twins share all of their DNA. So if you can show that there's a larger correlation of personality with monozygotic twins than dizygotic twins, it suggests to some extent that this temperament is inherited. And that's exactly what he found in multiple twin studies that he referenced. Okay, next is Jerome Kagan and amygdala reactivity. And this is very interesting. He is an American-born research psychologist. You can sort of view him as a progression to Isaac. He believed also that introversion and extroversion were heritable. His research is probably the most convincing to that effect. As such, it makes sense that he worked with children, infants to be precise, and he theorized that it was not the gateway between the midbrain and the cortex that was variable, but rather the midbrain itself, and to be most precise, the amygdala. He's famous for a longitudinal study started in 1989, which was at least still going in 2012. I'm not sure if it's still active today, where he collected 468 healthy newborn 4-month-olds, and then basically interviewed them. And you're wondering, how did he interview them? He exposes them to a range of novel stimuli where and then observes their reactions, specifically tries to observe how excitable they are. He exposes them to things like tape-recorded voices, some of which were parents and others were random voices. He does popped balloons, colored mobiles, as well as various novel scents like alcohol on a swab. And then watch the infants react and categorize and try to score their responses. In scoring the responses, he looked for things like thrashing of one or more limbs, arching of the back, fretting, crying, smiling, as well as changes in vital signs. And what he found was interesting. He was able to separate out 3 different groups or categories of infants. The most excitable, he called the high reactive group, which was about 20% of the population. The largest group was the least excitable, or the low reactive group, which made up about 40%, and then the somewhere in between, which made up about 20%. And he continued to track the high reactive and low reactive groups over the next months and years. He retested them at 11 months, and then again at 20 months, and then again at 4, 7, and 11 years. Obviously, he lost some of the participants over time, but at 11 years, he still had over half the sample, 237. Does anybody want to guess which type became introverts and which type became extroverts? All right, I'll tell you. So the high reactives grew up to be introverts, and the low reactives grew up to be extroverts. And he theorized basically that, The high reactives were most likely to be avoidant. So this is what he said. High reactives were most likely to be avoidant of unfamiliar events at early ages and emotionally subdued, cautious, and wary of new situations at later ages. By contrast, the low reactives were the least avoidant of unfamiliarity in the second year and most emotionally spontaneous and sociable at later ages. He theorized that the amygdala in the midbrain harbors this innate spectrum of reactivity. Those with a highly reactive amygdala are easily spooked by unfamiliar things, which lends the owner to adopt this state of constant alert attention, where they're constantly just looking around and trying to evaluate their circumstances. High reactives therefore grow up to be introverts who are easily exhausted by external stimuli because they are constantly monitoring and they feel like they're always on. His research not only links introversion and extroversion, but lends evidence that to some extent temperament actually is inherited and may even persist through adulthood. He wasn't able to himself confirm the adulthood part, but one of his proteges actually did a study in 2012 where he went out and found 135 of Kagan's original high and low reactives. And he used fMRI to try to prove what he was suggesting about the reactivity of the amygdala. You guys will remember, or maybe you won't, that fMRI is basically observes changes in cerebral blood flow, which is thought to act as a surrogate for brain activity. So the idea is you have them do something while they're in the MRI, and then whatever part of the brain that's involved in that reaction lights up. And sure enough, what he showed was, so what he did was he put them in the fMRI and showed these 18-year-olds familiar and unfamiliar faces. And sure enough, the introverts, he demonstrated exactly what Kagan had said, that the introverts or the high reactives had a significant reactivity that was visible in the amygdala that was much greater than the reactivity of the extroverts or the low reactives. So the next theory, so Kagan and Schwartz both have theories that at their core focus on introversion and introverted physiology. They demonstrate this innate and retained sensitivity to novel stimulus, which they say explains introverted behavior. But what about extroverts? What about their physiology can be used to explain behavior? And this is where you have a whole host of very recent studies and evidence on something called reward sensitivity. In order to understand further what that means, I wanted to show you a brief clip because you probably don't remember anything about the mesocortical and the mesolimbic pathways of the amygdala.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the reward system. The reward system refers to a group of structures that are activated whenever we experience something rewarding, like using an addictive drug. When exposed to a rewarding stimulus, the brain responds by increasing release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Thus, structures that are considered part of the reward system are found along the major dopamine pathways in the brain. The pathway most often associated with reward is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which starts in an area of the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The VTA is one of the principal dopamine-producing areas in the brain, and the mesolimbic dopamine pathway connects it with the nucleus accumbens, a nucleus found in a part of the brain that is strongly associated with motivation and reward, called the ventral striatum. When we use an addictive drug or experience something rewarding, dopamine neurons in the VTA are activated. These neurons project to the nucleus accumbens via the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and their activation causes dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens to rise. Another major dopamine pathway, the mesocortical pathway, also originates in the VTA, but travels to the cerebral cortex, specifically to the frontal lobes. It is also activated during rewarding experiences and is considered part of the reward system. Because dopamine is released whenever we use an addictive drug, researchers initially thought dopamine must be the neurotransmitter that causes pleasure. More recent research, however, suggests that dopamine activity doesn't correlate exactly with pleasure. For example, dopamine neurons are activated before a reward is actually received, and thus before the pleasure is experienced. For this and other reasons, it is now thought that dopamine has roles other than causing pleasure, such as assigning importance to environmental stimuli associated with rewards and increasing reward seeking. Whatever the precise role of dopamine in reward is, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway is consistently activated during rewarding experiences, leading it to be considered the main structure of the reward system. Regardless, the actual network of brain structures involved in mediating reward is much larger and more complex than just this dopamine pathway, involving many other brain regions and neurotransmitters.
So quickly to recap, right, you have the mesolimbic and the mesocortical pathways, both of which depend on the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, which controls the amount of dopamine that's basically injected into the reward system. And so the idea is the theory of reward sensitivity suggests that what separates extroverts and introverts is a more robust VTA, or a more robust reward system. Richard Depue is a neuroscientist and neuroanatomist and researcher who's done a lot of research on this both in animals and humans. And he says, to recap, the individual differences in the functioning of the reward system arise from functional variation in the VTA, dopamine projections, which are all directly involved in encoding the intensity of incentive motivation. So you can think about his, I'll get there in a second. You can think about his theory as kind of parallel to Kagan's. So recall that we said Kagan portrayed introverts as more sensitive to novelty, which then causes them to act withdrawn as they pause to study their surroundings. Reward sensitivity suggests that extroverts are more sensitive to reward-seeking behavior, which causes them to seek out external experience more aggressively and maybe be more goal-oriented in the way that they approach life and challenges. So this is an experiment that Richard Depue did, which is pretty complicated. I'm going to try to explain it as best I can, but I think it highlights a lot of what he's talking about. So he's out of Cornell, and he recruited 70 Cornell students between 19 and 24 years old. And he split them into introversion and extroversion based on a previously validated self-responding questionnaire. And what he did was he tried to set out to prove a difference in contextual conditioning between introverts and extroverts. So contextual conditioning, just to remind everyone, is basically the Pavlovian dog. You guys remember that the dogs and they're basically conditioned to salivate by ringing a bell. And you expose them, you condition them with food first, and then ultimately you create this association with two previously unrelated contexts, the bell, and then they salivate when you ring the bell. So in this case, he gave students amphetamine, and over the course of 4 days, he was able to demonstrate a measurable difference in conditioning between the extroverts and the introverts. Basically, the extroverts were ultimately more responsive to the amphetamine than were the introverts. He says that the extroverts in our study showed greater association of context with reward than introverts, which means that over time, extroverts will acquire a more extensive network of reward context memories that activates their brain's reward system. So there's some more evidence that's a little bit more approachable that this incentive motivation exists. One study observed, again, fMRI. They put introverts and extroverts into an fMRI machine and had them gamble or bet, and they then watched what happened, and they observed that extroverts lit up in their reward system, the mesocortical and the mesolimbic areas, much stronger than introverts. There's also studies that have compared the actual size of the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the mesocortical pathway, and showed that extroverts have a larger prefrontal cortex, or orbital frontal cortex, than introverts. And lastly, you can just look at population statistics on risk-seeking behavior. Extroverts are more likely to be killed from driving or engage in extreme sports and be injured. They're more likely to engage in extramarital affairs, and they have riskier sexual encounters than do introverts. The last study that we're going to talk about, and then we'll wrap up, again, I think it's a little bit more approachable and talks about a similar thing to Depue, still with incentive motivation. This is Joseph Newman, who's a research psychologist out of U of Wisconsin. He interprets Depue's ideas a little differently, and he basically, and I like it because it doesn't just portray extroverts as adrenaline junkies. He basically suggests that extroverts are just more goal-oriented than introverts, which I think is much more approachable and makes sense. He demonstrates this in this interesting experiment where he pairs introverts and extroverts while they're solving a simple number game. Basically, he puts random numbers up which do have a pattern and then has them click a button and guess on the number if it's a good number or a bad number. If they guess correctly, they get points, and if they guess incorrectly, they get points taken away. The idea is that over the course of multiple iterations, both groups figure out what the pattern is and they're able to move on. But what was interesting is that while both groups ultimately ended up figuring out the puzzle, when introverts got the wrong answer, they slowed down. Whereas when extroverts got the wrong answer, they actually sped up. If you forced extroverts to slow down, their performance improved much faster than if you let them keep going, even though they ultimately reached the same end. And basically, Newman says that extroverts are goal-oriented. So according to him, they have a tendency to act impulsively when working towards goal-oriented tasks. Introverts, on the other hand, tend to work more reflectively. He suggests that extroverts can devote up to 100% of their cognitive capacity toward completing a task. They just dive headfirst and they're able to just brute force it out. Whereas introverts don't do this. They consistently dedicate part of their capacity to monitor how the process is going and how they're doing at getting the task done. This tends to cause introverts to work more slowly, especially when there's a time task or some kind of social pressure involved. One of my favorite quotes by Susan Cain, which displays this very, very elegantly, is that extroverts crave rewards while introverts break for trouble. And I definitely resonate with this idea. I can sometimes get so caught up in the process that I lose the forest for the trees. And I tend to be a perfectionist, and I have to constantly remind myself to maintain perspective and just get the job done. Discharge the patient, discharge, right? So far, I promise we really are getting close. So far, we have been talking only about innate or inherent characteristics. Isaac, Kagan, Schwartz, Depue all propose different physiological bases for introversion and extroversion. However, I don't think that any of them would argue that nature or genetics is the sole component to behavior. Kagan himself speculated that temperament was only 40 to 50% heritable. And the other half of this equation is obviously nurture and the environment. And I didn't spend too much time on this theory or this concept because I think that you all agree that the idea of the gene environment theory is that genes provide the setup, which is then altered or adjusted by the environment and experience. And I think it's obvious to all of us the significance that our parents, hi mom, and our life experience to date have had on the people that we become. By some mix of culture, genetics, and experience, we have all landed somewhere on the introversion-extroversion spectrum. I'm less interested personally in trying to explain or guess which components are most important. I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to answer that. What is more interesting to me is whether you can move along the spectrum. Can you and should you alter your behavior in a way that is contradictory to your true self? Can you move along the spectrum when the situation requires it? Is there such a thing as pseudo-extroverts? And Susan Cain has a really interesting answer to this, and I tend to agree with her, though some of you may not. She believes that the basic answer is yes, but with one major caveat. She believes that you can pull yourself along the spectrum when the need arises, but you cannot live there. According to Cain, there are three components that must be satisfied in order to do so. First, you have to recognize who you are. And this makes sense because if you don't know where you are, you don't know which way you need to move yourself. Then you have to utilize what she calls restorative niches, which I'll get to in a second. And lastly, your actions, she says, must be in the pursuit of core personal projects, things that are just overwhelmingly meaningful to you. The first one, I think all of us will agree, is pretty easy, pure and simple. For us, working at downstate in Kings County, over the last 8 years, me personally, watching this environment in this community, our commitment to patients and care is so uniquely profound. I have no doubt that every one of us meets this criteria. We're all extremely dedicated to this life. And I think for me personally, part of the reason that I was unsatisfied in a previous career was that my engagement did not meet a core personal pursuit. Whereas now I believe that it does. And I believe that all of you are there with me. We put ourselves and our families at risk on a daily basis now, so more than ever. And we do so because we really believe in what we do. So this one's easy. Number one is probably the most difficult. Recognizing where you are. It requires a sense of self-awareness, which I have no easy way to tell you how to find. For me, it's taken years of my life. I've spent time with psychiatrists, plural. I've had difficult conversations with friends and colleagues. I've cried and doubted myself and struggled. I've yelled at my mother repeatedly. I've switched careers. I lost touch with a lot of close friends. I made a lot of new ones. And all of this, I'm still scratching the surface and trying to figure it out. You really need to step outside yourself and think about the kind of person you are, the things that make you happy, and what works for you. And there are no shortcuts. Number two is interesting. I'm going to try my best not to call this wellness, but that's kind of what it is. It's the idea that you all need to cut yourself some slack. You need to realize that you expend an incredible amount of energy when you act outside your true self. And every time you do, you need to recharge before you can do it again. If you continuously act in a manner that is not consistent with who you are, I promise that you will all burn out. And you won't even know why. And so in conclusion, just a couple pointers and advice based on what we just talked about for some of the introverted residents like me. I apologize in advance for the extroverts in the room if they feel left out, but Ronnie is always available if you need him. So Hans Eysenck, right, is about optimal arousal. Understand that you are your most productive when you are properly stimulated. When you are over or understimulated, you will struggle. Most importantly, it will drain you faster than your colleagues. Obviously, you can't always choose your environments, but when that happens, you must set aside time to rest and understand how important it is for you to function. With regard to Kagan and reactivity, understand that you are uncomfortable with the unfamiliar. New people and new surroundings will place you on alert. This will make transitions in your life more difficult than your peers, and again, will tire you. But you will catch up because you are excellent at processing reactions, and you will catch details and emotional cues about your surroundings that others will miss. And lastly, about reward sensitivity, understand that you are less goal-oriented than your colleagues. If you try to measure your progress against theirs in concrete terms like patients per hour, you probably will be disappointed. You constantly devote part of your cognitive capacity to monitoring how you work rather than how much you accomplish. This may slow you initially, but ultimately it will make you more efficient in the long run. And with that, thank you, everybody.